Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to unpack one of the most fascinating and honestly deeply ironic stories in modern history. We're diving into the origins of Indian nationalism. It is the story of how a vast, incredibly diverse subcontinent, literally divided by hundreds of languages, totally distinct cultures, and huge geographies, somehow managed to forge a single, unified national identity. Now, as you can imagine, this absolutely didn't happen overnight. It was more like a slow-building powder keg, which was eventually set off by a few undeniable sparks. So you might be wondering, how do you actually unite a subcontinent? It's an immense challenge. Think about the sheer scale of India in the 19th century. We're talking about millions of people living across completely different regions who suddenly find themselves governed by a single foreign entity, the world's most powerful empire. How do you get people from the northern plains and the southern coasts to realize that, hey, we're actually fighting the exact same fight here? Well, let's dive right in. Here's our roadmap for this explainer. We'll start with the seeds of a nation, move on to the tools of the oppressor, examine the breaking point, track the rise of the middle class, and finally map out the first political associations. Okay, starting off with Section 1, the seeds of a nation, and realizing a shared fate. You see, the birth of nationalism in India wasn't happening in a vacuum. It was this highly complex mix of global inspiration, like the ideas spreading from the French Revolution, and a very local Indian Renaissance. People were waking up to a really stark contradiction. On one side, colonial interests were entirely based on extraction, just pulling wealth out. And this constant drain was the root cause of India's economic backwardness. But on the flip side, Indian interests obviously required economic progress, and uniquely to achieve that progress, it required the involvement of all sections and classes of Indian society. Slowly but surely, the realization hit. Their economic survival was completely incompatible with British imperialist policies. And the reality on the ground was shifting too. The British process of unifying the country, politically and administratively, had this massive, albeit unintended, economic side effect. Basically, if crops failed in one region, it now directly and immediately affected the prices and food supply in a completely different region. It's kind of like modern global supply chains today, right? A disruption in one hub impacts the whole network. The economic fate of people living hundreds, even thousands of miles apart was suddenly linked. Their struggles weren't just local anymore. They were shared. They were national. Which brings us to Section 2, Tools of the Oppressor. And this has a seriously ironic twist. To extract all those resources and control the population, the British built what basically became an unintended arsenal. I mean, they had to build modern transport, particularly the railways. But what did those railways actually do? They brought Indian leaders from wildly different regions physically together, sitting in the same train cars and meeting halls. To administer their courts, they pushed the English language. But English actually became the ultimate bridge, letting nationalist leaders from totally different linguistic regions finally communicate with each other. And by pushing Western education, they accidentally handed Indians the chance to absorb modern ideas of democracy. This created a brand new middle-class intelligentsia that became the absolute nucleus of political unrest. And of course, with that education came the immense power of the press. The second half of the 19th century saw an explosive, completely unprecedented growth of Indian-owned newspapers, both in English and in local vernacular languages. The colonial rulers tried time and time again to shut it down or impose restrictions, but the press pushed back hard. They consistently urged the people to unite. These papers heavily criticized official policies and became the main vehicle for spreading those dangerous modern ideas to the masses, ideas like self-government, democracy, and civil rights. But here's a fascinating detail. While looking forward to democracy, Indians were also looking backward. The educated classes began to rediscover India's own rich historical past. They started learning about their well-developed historical, political, and economic institutions, their flourishing historic trade, and their arts. Plus, European scholars were putting forward theories that the Indo-Aryans actually shared the exact same ethnic roots as the nations of Europe. Imagine the psychological boost this provided. It completely shattered that colonial myth of Indian inferiority and replaced it with deep, undeniable historical pride. It is a powerful reminder of how vital reclaiming your own narrative really is. All right, moving into Section 3, the breaking point. This is where we look at some incredibly reactionary policies. So, the powder keg is built, and now here come the sparks.
In rapid succession, Viceroy Lytton introduced a series of policies just dripping with racial arrogance. In 1876, the maximum age for the Indian civil service exam was drastically reduced to just 19 years old. 19! This made it nearly impossible for Indians to compete for any administrative roles. Then, in 1877, the British threw the lavish Grand Delhi Durbar, this huge, extravagant party, while the country was in the deadly grip of a severe famine. It was a shocking display of callousness. By 1878, they clamped down on free speech and self-defense with the Vernacular Press Act and the Arms Act. This rapid-fire sequence of events provoked an absolute storm of opposition across the entire country. But it was this next controversy that fundamentally changed the Indian mindset. Following Lytton, a new viceroy named Ripon tried a relatively progressive move known as the Ilbert Bill. The goal was simple: abolish judicial disqualifications based on race. Basically, give Indian judges the exact same powers to try cases as European judges. Makes sense, right? Well, the European community in India erupted in stiff, highly racist opposition, and they actually forced Ripon to modify and effectively defeat his own bill. For the Indian middle class watching this unfold, the lesson was crystal clear. Justice was never just going to be handed to them. Active, unified resistance was literally their only option left.
Which brings us perfectly to Section 4, Rise of the Middle Class and a True Generational Shift.
You see, early in the 19th century, the political landscape was mostly dominated by wealthy landlords and aristocrats. Their approach was pretty conservative. They favored sending long, polite petitions to the British Parliament asking for minor, local administrative tweaks. But remember those British innovations we discussed? They had birthed a completely new demographic, the urban, educated, middle-class intelligentsia. We are talking about fiery lawyers, journalists, doctors, and teachers. They didn't just want local tweaks anymore. They had a much wider perspective and were ready to push a massive national agenda.
And that leads us to our final section, Section 5, First Political Associations. Let's map out this resistance. You can literally trace this generational shift right here in Bengal. We start around 1836 and 1843 with groups that eventually merged into the British Indian Association in 1851. Now, that group was mostly looking out for landlords. But fast forward to 1875, and Shishir Kumar Ghosh starts the Indian League, specifically to stimulate a real sense of nationalism. And just 1 year later, in 1876, younger, much more radical nationalists like Surendranath Banerjee and Anandi Mohan Bose established the Indian Association of Calcutta. They were completely done with the conservative, pro-landlord policies of the older generation. They wanted true, mobilized nationalism on the ground. But hey, this political awakening wasn't just isolated to Bengal. Brilliant minds across Bombay and Madras were simultaneously getting organized. Over in Bombay, you had Madhav Govind Ranade founding the Pune Sarvajanik Sabha back in 1867 to bridge the gap between the government and the people, and later we see the Bombay Presidency Association. Down south in Madras, the Mahajan Sabha was formed in 1884. Across all these major regions, educated Indians were independently building the infrastructure of resistance, connecting their people, and loudly demanding their civil rights. And get this, they even took the fight directly to the center of the empire. In 1866, Dadabhai Naoroji organized the East India Association right in London. The strategy there was to directly discuss the Indian question and influence public men in England to promote Indian welfare. They were literally using every single avenue available, local, national, and international, to make sure their voices were heard. So what does this all mean for us today? Well, all of this history leaves us with a truly fascinating conclusion to ponder. Did the colonial empire actually engineer its own exit by forging the very tools of its unified resistance? I mean, by building the railways, introducing English, and pushing Western education, the British Empire inadvertently handed a diverse, fractured subcontinent exactly what it needed to become one unified nation. It's a profound lesson in the unintended consequences of history. This entire era of organization and awakening set the perfect stage for the impending birth of the Indian National Congress. But, that is a story for another time. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep asking those big questions, and I'll see you next time.